The scandal was already rotting in public view, but now the whispers coming out of Sandringham are darker, stranger, and far more humiliating than anyone expected, because the new claim tearing through royal gossip circles is this: Prince Andrew was allegedly banned from leaving the property after a midnight disturbance turned his already toxic exile into a full-blown palace embarrassment. There are disgraced exits, and then there are royal downfalls so viciously symbolic that they almost feel staged by fate itself, and this one has all the ingredients of a late-night royal nightmare. A once untouchable prince, a brother now dependent on the mercy of a king who can no longer publicly protect him, a farmhouse retreat that looks less like refuge and more like supervised isolation, and then this explosive new murmur slithering through the dark. Something happened after midnight. Something loud enough, strange enough, or unsettling enough that the already humiliating restrictions around Andrew were allegedly tightened even further. And suddenly, the question is no longer whether he has fallen. That part is over. The question now is how much lower the palace is prepared to let him sink before the final door is slammed shut. Because let's be honest, this is not a man enjoying some peaceful countryside reset. This is not a misunderstood royal taking time away from public life. This is a man whose name has become radioactive, whose reputation has collapsed in layers, whose movements are already being watched with the kind of cold caution reserved for people institutions no longer trust to manage themselves. That was the atmosphere before this latest midnight claim, before the latest whispers, before locals allegedly began muttering that whatever happened that night was the moment the mood around Wood Farm shifted from awkward containment to outright alarm. And when the neighbors around a royal estate begin whispering about raised voices, strange movement, lights at odd hours, and doors opening when they should have remained shut, the story stops being about privacy and starts becoming about control. Now picture the scene, because this is where the humiliation deepens into something almost operatic. It is late. Sandringham is supposed to sleep in that eerie, stately silence that only old estates seem to have, the kind of silence that makes every crunch of gravel sound like a confession. Somewhere behind the respectable stillness of that property, in the very house where Andrew has already been tucked away under a cloud of scandal and suspicion, something allegedly breaks that silence. A disturbance. Not a public scandal exploding on camera. Not an official incident written up in neat legal language. Worse, a midnight disturbance claim. The kind of phrase that is maddeningly vague and therefore infinitely more dangerous, because vague stories grow teeth faster than specific ones. Was it anger? Was it panic? Was it frustration boiling over inside a man whose world has narrowed from palaces, patronages, and privilege to pre-approved visitors and watched exits? Nobody publicly says. Nobody ever fully says. But in royal gossip, what is not said is often where the real terror lives, and that is exactly why this new development feels so poisonous. If the earlier restrictions made Andrew look diminished, this alleged ban on leaving the property after the disturbance makes him look contained, not inconveniently managed. Contained. There is a brutal difference between the two. Managed means there is still some dignity left to preserve. Contained means the institution has stopped worrying about appearances and started worrying about consequences. That is when the walls close in. That is when a resident starts to feel less like a home and more like a boundary line. And look at the symbolism, because with royal stories, the symbolism is always doing half the work. Andrew allegedly being banned from leaving after dark hours claims is not merely a practical restriction. It is an image. A fallen prince, once photographed entering banquets, ceremonies, and high-level meetings, now allegedly unable to cross the boundary of a rural estate because the atmosphere around him has become too volatile, too embarrassing, too risky. That image is lethal. It tells the public that the palace does not merely distrust the outside world around Andrew. It may now distrust Andrew within it. What is especially savage about this latest twist is how naturally it fits into the pattern of everything that has already happened. The exile from royal life, the humiliating downgrade, the scrutiny, the policing of access, the sense that decisions are now being made around him, above him, despite him. This new claim does not feel random. It feels like escalation. It feels like what happens when quiet containment fails and the institution decides to harden the perimeter. That is why people are talking. That is why this story has traveled so fast. Because whether the details are ever fully confirmed or not, the development feels believable in the most brutal way possible. And in scandal, believability is gasoline. There is also something deeply telling about the timing of all this, because it comes after a period where Andrew had already been pushed into what can only be described as a symbolic corner, stripped of movement, stripped of visibility, stripped of autonomy in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. And yet, even within that reduced space, even within that controlled environment, something allegedly still happened. Something that triggered a new layer of restriction, and that raises a question that is quietly echoing through every version of this story, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. If the problem persists even under control, what happens next? Because control can only tighten so much before it becomes something else entirely, before it stops being management and starts looking like confinement. And that is where the optics become dangerous, not just for Andrew, but for the institution itself, because the monarchy has always thrived on the illusion of dignity, of order, of quiet authority, and there is nothing dignified about the image of a prince who cannot leave his residence because of alleged disturbances in the night. There is nothing orderly about whispers of unrest inside a property that was meant to shield him from chaos. And there is certainly nothing quiet about a story that continues to mutate, evolve, and escalate every time it begins to settle. And yet, despite all of this, despite the humiliation, the restrictions, the whispers, the laughter from locals, the growing sense that the walls are not just closing in, but locking into place, there is still this eerie silence from Andrew himself. A silence that feels heavier now than it did before, because before it could be explained as strategy, as legal caution, as advice from those trying to protect what little remains of his position. But now it feels different. Now it feels like absence, like retreat, like a man who understands that anything he says will not shift the narrative, because the narrative is no longer being shaped by him. It is being shaped around him, above him, without him. And that is perhaps the most brutal transformation of all, the loss of narrative control. Because once you lose control of the story begins to define you in ways that are almost impossible to reverse. And right now, the story defining Andrew is one of decline, of restriction, of whispers, of midnight disturbances and alleged bands and neighbors who are no longer silent observers, but active participants in the shaping of his public image. And that kind of story does not stabilize, it accelerates. What makes this even more explosive is the way these developments are stacking on top of each other, because it is not just one scandal, not just one moment, not just one bad headline. It is a sequence, a pattern, a chain of events that all point in the same direction, downward, and every new detail, every new whisper, every new claim, whether fully confirmed or not, adds another layer to that descent until eventually the weight of it becomes impossible to ignore, even for those who once defended him, even for those who once believed the situation could be contained quietly behind palace walls. And you have to ask yourself, because this is the question that sits underneath all of this noise, all of this drama, all of this speculation: how far is the institution willing to go to protect itself from him now? Because that is what this has become. Not how far will they go to protect him, but how far will they go to distance themselves from him? And those are two very different strategies with very different endings. Because distancing has a trajectory. It starts with quiet restrictions, then visible limitations, then symbolic downgrades, then social isolation, then institutional separation. And by the time the final step arrives, it does not feel sudden. It feels inevitable, like something that has been building for so long that when it finally happens, the reaction is not shock, but recognition. And right now, with these alleged new developments, with this midnight disturbance claim hanging in the air like a question nobody can fully answer, but everyone is talking about, it feels like the story is moving closer to that final stage, closer to a point where the institution may decide that containment is no longer enough, that distance is no longer sufficient, that a more permanent, more decisive action is required to close this chapter once and for all. Because here is the truth that sits at the center of all this chaos: the monarchy survives by adapting, by cutting away what threatens its stability, by reshaping itself in response to pressure. And when one of its own becomes a source of continuous instability, continuous embarrassment, continuous risk, history suggests that the response is not hesitation, it is resolution. And that is why this story feels like it is still building, still moving, still far from over. Because every new development, real or rumored, is not just another headline, it is another step in a process that seems to be leading somewhere very specific, somewhere final, somewhere from which there is no quiet return. So now the question is no longer whether Andrew can recover his position. That question has already been answered by everything that has happened so far. The real question is what the final shape of his exit will look like, whether it will be slow and silent, fading into obscurity behind estate walls, or whether it will be sharp and public, a decisive moment that draws a clear line between him and the institution he once represented. Because one thing is already clear: whatever protection once surrounded him has thinned to almost nothing. Whatever patience once existed has worn down under the weight of repeated controversy, and whatever room he once had to move freely, both physically and symbolically, is shrinking with every new development, every new whisper, every new claim that pulls the narrative further away from redemption and deeper into something far more irreversible. And as strange, as dramatic, and as almost surreal as this entire story has become, it is still unfolding, still shifting, still revealing new layers that suggest we have not yet seen the full extent of where this ends. Because stories like this, stories built on power, scandal, and the quiet machinery of institutions protecting themselves, do not end quietly, they end definitively, and everything happening right now feels like the build up to that moment.